We have a tremendous panel for you this evening on a very important topic. You know, this event is the latest in a series of what we've been calling teach-ins that we started in the fall of 2016, intended to focus on issues of great relevance today. Past panels have dealt with women's rights, civil liberties, climate change, education, gun control, and immigration. And today's session came about when we were asked to host a discussion on access to justice, which is the subject of the winter issue of Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Access to justice is a rather understated term, referring to the vast gulf, what's been called the justice gap, that exists between the huge number of poor and economically struggling Americans who have a problem that a lawyer or someone knowledgeable about the law could help them solve, and the much smaller number of people who manage to get that kind of help. The access problem is part of America's overall and increasingly alarming and debilitating inequality challenge. The articles in Daedalus examine the causes and extent of this national crisis in civil legal services facing poor and low-income Americans. The essays look at what's being done to try to close this huge justice gap and at the various interests, constituencies, and stakeholders involved. Our panelists this evening have all played a part in calling public attention to and addressing this issue. The moderator will be David Rubenstein, right here to my right, who is co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group. David holds many other leadership positions as well, among them chair of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations and chair of the board of the Smithsonian Institution. He's also been a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for half a dozen years now and co-wrote the introduction to the Daedalus issue. And I want to recognize his role as one of our nation's leading philanthropists. A contribution of his that's especially dear to us here at PNP is its financing of the National Book Festival, which has become the largest single-day book event in the country. And the next festival will be the Saturday before Labor Day, so don't miss it. As a further sign of David's ongoing generosity, he's purchased all the copies of the Daedalus issue that PNP had ordered for this event and arranged for them to be distributed free to all of you. So if you haven't gotten one yet, raise your hand. And I just learned he's coming out with a book too. Do you know when?
October 28th.
October 28th. And what's the title?
The American Story.
The American Story. So, you know, hopefully we'll get him back for an event when the book is out. Now, David, for all his other talents, is also a natural interviewer, which is regularly apparent on the show he hosts on Bloomberg TV and PBS called The David Rubenstein Show, Peer-to-Peer Conversations. And the other panelists who'll be talking with here in a minute are also a very, very impressive group. We have the other male on the panel is Ken Frazier, who's the author of one of the articles in the Daedalus issue called Why Big Business Should Support Legal Aid. An attorney by training, Ken joined the pharmaceutical giant Merck more than 25 years ago and did a lot of other things other than lawyering for a number of years, and then eventually became a general counsel before taking over 8 years ago as CEO. He also serves on several boards and is co-chair of the Leaders Council of the Legal Services Corporation. Now, that organization, created 45 years ago under legislation signed by President Nixon, has become the single largest funder of civil legal aid for low-income Americans in the nation. But these days, it's fighting for its life under the Trump administration. Martha Minow, who is next to David, in between David and Ken, is a Harvard professor and former dean of Harvard's law school. She's co-chair of the Legal Services Corporation and serves as co-chair as well of the American Academy's project called Making Justice Accessible. Martha also sits on a number of boards, and she too has a book coming out this fall titled When Should Law Forgive? feel free to talk up your books in a moment. And finally, we have Becky Sandefur, who is one of the co-editors of the Daedalus issue and author of an article in it called Access to What? She's a sociologist and legal scholar at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's also a faculty fellow at the American Bar Foundation, where she founded and leads the Access to Justice Research Initiative. Last fall, Becky was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship for her work about how to increase civil legal aid for low-income Americans. So there you have it, a stellar group. Please join me in welcoming all our panelists.
So thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much for hosting us, and thank you all for coming today. Can you hear me? Okay. Let me just put this in context, if I could, before I ask some of the questions to the panelists. The context is this. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, with about 3 days to go, two members of the Constitutional Convention, Elbridge Gerry and George Mason, said, "What about a Bill of Rights?" And James Madison, who wanted to get it over, and they were all, it was sweating, there was no air conditioning, the flies were getting bigger, said, no, we got to finish right away. We don't have time to debate a Bill of Rights. And besides, Bill of Rights, every state has a Bill of Rights in its constitution, their own state constitution, so why do we need a federal Bill of Rights? So James Madison, the father of the Constitution, so-called, he prevented the debate on that, really, and they really didn't. They adjourned in September of 1787 without a Bill of Rights. The effort to ratify the Constitution, though, made it clear that many of the states wanted a Bill of Rights. And in fact, Virginia barely ratified it. And James Madison worked very hard for the ratification. The governor of the state, Patrick Henry, was against the ratification. Now, all the states that ratified it did not do so on the requirement that there be a Bill of Rights, but it was clear to people that there should be a Bill of Rights. And James Madison, although prevented by Patrick Henry from being a senator, was elected to the House, beating James Monroe. As a member of the House, he felt obligated that there be a Bill of Rights, and he began drafting a Bill of Rights. But it turned out the first Congress didn't want a Bill of Rights. Why? Well, those people who liked the Constitution, they said if we amend the Constitution now, it'll be apparent that we have flaws in the Constitution and people will criticize us. So why should we amend it? It's an admission of defeat and failure. Those people who didn't like the Constitution, they didn't want a Bill of Rights either because they wanted the Constitution to fail, and they thought a Bill of Rights would make it less likely that it would fail. So there was a lot of opposition. Finally, after much back and forth, James Madison got a bill through the House with about, I think, 14 amendments to the Constitution, which he wanted embedded into the Constitution, not amended to the end, but put throughout the Constitution. Went over to the Senate. Senate came back, and ultimately the Congress passed 12 amendments to the Constitution. The states then ratified 10 of them, not all of them. One of them has since been ratified, the 27th Amendment. And that amendment was the amendment that said that members of Congress cannot have their salary increased during the time that they're in Congress. They have to wait for an election. Now, that one was not approved by the states because the states didn't want members of Congress to ever have their salary increased. It wasn't just after an election. In any event, the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution, the Sixth Amendment said that if you are tried in a crime, accused of a crime by the federal government, you have the right to, among other things, a competent counsel or counsel and assistance of counsel. And there was a fear that the British had often accused Americans before the end of the war of crimes, and they didn't have proper counsel. They weren't accused, they weren't told of the charges and so forth. So in the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution, you are entitled to counsel. Okay, so let's put that in the back of your mind. In 1961, a man named Clarence Gideon is accused of breaking into a pool hall and stealing some cash. He is arrested and tried. And at the trial, he says to the judge, it's in Panama City, Florida, I can't afford counsel. Can you appoint counsel for me? And the judge said, well, under Florida law, there is no right to counsel unless it's a capital offense. And you're not accused of a capital offense, so you have no right to counsel. And at that time, the Supreme Court of the United States had never said that the Sixth Amendment applied to state crimes. So the state of Florida said, unless it's a capital offense or you don't have a right to counsel. The Supreme Court had earlier said that if you were incompetent, you had a mental problem or you were illiterate, you would have right to counsel in addition to a capital offense, let's say. But there was no a problem here. So as a result of that, there was no mental barrier. Clarence Gideon, who was illiterate but didn't have a mental barrier or had not been accused of a capital offense, he had to try the case himself, and he did. He tried the case. He made opening statements. He made closing statements. He interrogated witnesses, and the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. When he was in prison, he wrote a pro se petition to the United States Supreme Court saying, I am entitled to counsel, and I was denied it. And the Supreme Court decided to take this case, and they listened to it. They appointed Abe Fortas, who later became a justice of the Supreme Court, to argue the case. And ultimately, a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court in Gideon v. Wainwright came out in 1963, in which it said that if you were accused of a crime, state or federal, you are entitled to counsel. If you're accused of a crime, federal or state, any type of federal crime, any type of state crime, you're entitled to counsel, and counsel will be appointed for you. So this is great. We have counsel for everybody who needs it. But there's a problem. It only applies in criminal situations, not civil. Most of the cases in the United States are actually civil cases, not criminal cases. So if you have a civil dispute, you're suing somebody or you want to sue somebody. For example, if you think you've been wrongly charged for something, or you're not getting your Social Security benefits, or you want to get veterans benefits and you have to sue to get it, you have to use your own. You're not entitled to counsel under our current law. And so the civil justice situation is completely different than the criminal justice. And what we're going to talk about today is the civil justice situation. Because on criminal justice, while you might say that the lawyer who is appointed to defend you might not be as great as the best lawyer in the country, at least you're entitled to counsel, and people typically get counsel. But you do not have a right to in a civil situation to get counsel in our country. So why don't we talk about this? And before we do, let me just ask you one opening question, Martha. You went to law school at Yale, and you've been the dean of the Harvard Law School. Which one is better?
Well, first of all, you gave a great description of that case and of the Constitution. So I want to actually hire you as a professor. But what I would say is that what's fabulous is that the United States has about 200 law schools. And there are many, many that are absolutely superb and excellent.
Okay.
And I am lucky enough to have gone to one and taught at another. And I think that there was a time about 8 years ago when applications to law schools went way down and people thought, who needs it? You know what? There's something that's changed. Some people call it the Trump bump. And a lot of people are now applying to law school, and I think it's really very encouraging that people understand the significance of law.
Okay. Ken, you are a graduate of Harvard Law School.
But I got over it.
But you're the CEO of one of the most important companies in our country, and I want to ask you a question, to be very serious. There's a measles outbreak in this country right now. There's a mumps outbreak as well. Is vaccination a bad thing for children? Can it give them autism or some other terrible disease?
You know, the scientific evidence could not be clearer that there is no link between measles vaccine or any vaccine and autism or any of the neurological issues that you typically see. People forget that the mortality rate for measles is about 2 for every 1,000 kids who get sick. And many children get much more sick. They have much greater disabilities. So I would say everybody, please encourage your friends to get their children vaccinated. People forget that there are young children who are too young to get a vaccine, who are at risk. There are people who have compromised immune systems who are at risk. And let's not forget that in the year 2000, measles was declared eradicated in the United States. And so we're bringing back diseases that had been in the dustbin of history.
Right. Becky, let me ask you a question. You received, as we heard, a MacArthur grant, which is called a Genius Grant. Do you feel like a genius when you got this? And what did your friends say to you? Did they call you up and say, we didn't know you were this smart, or what?
There are an enormous number of genius jokes,
right?
Particularly when you do something really stupid. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And you are an expert as well on income inequality. So is income inequality getting worse or better, or what's the situation generally?
In this period of history in our country, income inequality is at its highest since the very early years of the century. It's astonishing. If you compare us to other nations that we think of ourselves as similar to, that have democratic governments and market economies, we care much less about how the people at the bottom of the income structure live. It's not just that they have less money, they have less access to healthcare, they have less access to schooling, they have less access to law.
Hey, Martha, before I ask you a civil justice question, I can't resist this one other question. In your many years of teaching at Harvard Law School, who was your best student?
I had two students who, when they spoke, the other students put down their pens and listened. In 38 years of teaching, that's only happened twice. And one of them was a Catholic priest who then went to law school, and the other one was named Barack Obama.
Really? So did he ever say, I might be president of the United States someday to you, or he didn't say that?
No, but he thought about being mayor of Chicago.
Really? So why, Martha, do you think the founders of our country and those who were creating the Bill of Rights did not say, you're entitled to counsel for a civil justice matter? Why is it only criminal justice?
Well, as your history explains so well, the founders didn't even think about applying the Sixth Amendment to the states. And they thought the states would handle all of those kinds of justice questions. They did include the Fifth Amendment due process guarantee. And it's really through the Fifth Amendment due process guarantee that all of the access to justice issues in the civil context arise as a constitutional matter. But it's also the case that law was not as expansive. Right now, one reason that the difference between civil and criminal is so significant when it comes to access to justice is that people who have fines and fees because they actually violated criminal law, the fines and fees that they don't pay, those are civil matters. And not having a lawyer to deal with fines and fees, you may have followed what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, after the shooting of Michael Brown. The Department of Justice investigated what was going on there. Fines and fees being layered on the poorest people in the community, and there's no right to lawyers to help you manage the fines and fees. Or the risk of losing custody of your child. That's a civil matter, and there's no right to counsel. I think that for many people, the risk of losing your child may be at least as important as the risk of losing your liberty, I think more important, and there's no right to counsel. The framers of the Constitution didn't think about that. There wasn't a child welfare system that could terminate parental rights at that time. Those are issues that developed later.
Well, in civil justice cases or proceedings in our country, what percentage of them are involving people that are not involved with or using a lawyer? Is it a large percentage?
So it's enormous amount in nationwide in family law matters, which are the largest number of civil matters. The vast majority of cases, there is no lawyer, and in maybe 86% of the cases, there is underrepresentation. Maybe only one side has a lawyer.
Is there any evidence that if you don't have a lawyer, you're less likely to win that civil dispute?
There actually, in some areas, I wouldn't say there's evidence across the board, but when we get to data, we should really talk to Becky. I can say I have a colleague, Jim Greiner, who does randomized controlled studies, which they've learned from the healthcare, really the drug development world, randomized controlled studies, and they find in people facing the risk of eviction, people facing the loss of social welfare benefits, presence of a lawyer dramatically improve their chances of success.
So Ken, you're running a company with a market capitalization of what?
I think it was $205 billion the last time.
$205 billion. So if I were on your board of directors, I would say, Ken, this is a very nice cause, but you're the CEO of a $205 billion company. Why aren't you spending 24 hours a day on that? Why are you concerned about civil justice?
I think businesses that have been around for as long as we have, and that's about 130 years in Merck's case, have to take the long view. And I think that one of the big challenges that we have in our society now is the huge amount of mistrust that there is towards all kinds of institutions, governmental institutions, but also business institutions. And I think that those of us who depend on the rule of law, in my business, obviously, we have patents that support our inventions. We want to know that we can go into a court and have our property rights protected, the sanctity of our contracts protected. And I think it's short-sighted to think that you can have a system like that if most people don't feel that they have fair access to that system.
Now, did you come from an upper income background, and is this why you are you doing this because of noblesse oblige? Do you kind of feel that you should give back to society? You came from a very upper income part of the society, or not?
Hardly. I was born in the inner city of Philadelphia, and I know from firsthand experience that many people face problems, existential problems, you might say, that where they need lawyers and don't have access.
Your father was?
My father was a janitor. He had a third grade education, or what passed for a third grade education, for a black child born in the South at the turn of the 20th century.
And do your directors ever say, can you focus on vaccinations and other things, not this cause?
Yeah, a couple of them do say, Merck is one of the foremost medical firms, and why are you doing these lawyer things? But it sort of goes in one ear and out the other.
You want to? What are their names? Okay.
I'm sure some of them will watch the film.
Okay. So, Becky, right now, on income inequality, we focus on income inequality because we can easily see that some people are making much more than they did as a percentage of the population than years ago. But how is income inequality affected in this particular issue? People at the bottom of the economic strata, do they know how to get lawyers, or do they really usually get lawyers, or they know that they should get lawyers?
So inequalities in access to justice actually start way before lawyers. So if you look at civil justice problems, so then possibly losing your kids or needing to take care of your grandkid. So it seems totally reasonable that, like, if your child can't take care of your grandkid, you could just bring them into your home and enroll them in school and get them vaccinated, right? But you actually need legal instruments to do those things. The school won't let you do it. The doctor won't let you do it. So there are all kinds of problems like that happen to every group in society. And people of color are more likely to run into those problems than white people, and poor people are more likely to run into those problems than people who are not poor. Then the problems that they run into, the kinds of consequences they have, do they lose their house? Do they lose their job? Do they get to keep their child? Those are related to their characteristics as well. So poor people have worse outcomes of their justice problems than people who are not poor, and people of color have worse outcomes of their justice problems than white people do. That's even before you get to attorneys. I think when we think about the Legal Services Corporation, what the Legal Services Corporation does is it provides, as a matter of availability, attorneys to people who are at 125% of the poverty level or below. And some people are aware that those attorneys are available, and some of them aren't. But even if you are aware, I think there's someone in the room who can give us the precise number, one such attorney for every 6,000 people available for their services. So even if you know they're there and you know how to find them, they're very unlikely to be able to help you.
I see. Now, you were from the land of Lincoln, right? So was Abraham Lincoln, did he do work for people who couldn't afford his services, or did he give some legal services for free?
I'm sure he did, but I would like to make a different point about Abraham Lincoln. So if Abraham Lincoln were looking at civil justice today, he would be curious, as a self-educated lawyer, that now, in order to help people with their civil justice problems, you have to have 7 years of college. He didn't need 7 years of college to do that, or even to be president of the United States. And so one of the things I think if we want to think about access to justice is, are there other kinds of people with different kinds of training who could be doing some of the stuff that right now only lawyers can do?
Well, as a lawyer myself, I don't know whether I like that idea, because I spent all that time getting my law degree, and my mother said, your business career may not work, so keep your law license, which I still have kept just to make her happy. But so let me ask you about other countries. Is the United States that unique? In other countries of which you're aware, developed countries, are they giving counsel in civil justice matters to people?
So if you look at, I was talking about those other countries that are like us, they're democracies, they're market economies. Let's go to Europe. There are several countries in Europe where you have access to lawyers, legal services, not as a matter of right, but as an entitlement. So it's part of the welfare state that they put together that tries to make everything a little bit more equal for everybody and make sure everybody has a certain kind of floor. England, I think, still has, for some sets of justice problems, they will pay for, just like Medicare, it's called Judicare. You get money to pay a private attorney to help you with your justice problems.
So, Ken, you've mentioned another forum where we've been at that it costs the United States a lot of money to have people not have lawyers because they have to spend much more time resolving their problems, and therefore they can't work at their job because they have to take time off of work, and that hurts the GDP and the country's economy. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Certainly. So when people who have to come to work every day have issues with their children or with elders or with their house, that distracts them from coming to work and providing a full day's work. There's also an interesting study. I'm a Philadelphia lawyer, and I saw a study just the other day published in Philadelphia just looking at people who get lawyers to deal with their rental housing problems. And it suggested that if we spend $4 million in Philadelphia, we would avoid something like $50 million worth of downstream issues with respect to mental health, emergency rooms, inpatients, and just the cost of relocating people to other houses.
So, can you explain how the Nixon administration came to be the administration under which the Legal Services Corporation came into existence? Did President Nixon know what was going on, or what happened? How did that happen?
Well, he was a lawyer, and he actually supported the law. It did emerge out of the legacy of the war on poverty, but he actually understood the significance of having a justice system that was well regarded, and he supported it.
Okay. So we have the Legal Services Corporation, but why is that inadequate? In other words, it exists, it provides money, I assume, for people who need civil justice representation. Why is that inadequate, and why do we still have a problem?
The Legal Services Corporation is funded entirely by Congress. It supports 133 local offices, and many of them receive funds also from state and other sources. But in typical situation, the offices that I have visited, they turn people away every day. They turn at least half of the people who show up, and that's only a subset of all the people who have legal issues. And so there simply is not enough representation. But you raised the good point. Maybe we need to actually restructure the system more broadly so that you don't need a lawyer necessarily. Maybe there are other people who could help when someone is seeking, for example, protection against domestic violence, or when someone is seeking how to navigate the Veterans Administration. But by the way, why do we make it so hard to navigate the Veterans Administration? I mean, so there are changes altogether that could be made so that you don't need a lawyer to navigate and enforce your legal rights.
The budget of the United States is roughly close to $6 trillion, give or take. What is the budget of the Legal Services Corporation?
The actual appropriation from Congress is about $425 million. It's about 0.5% of the amount that the government spends on health care.
What was the proposal from OMB for the spending for the LSC?
It was essentially zero. There was enough money to shut it all down.
Okay. Who is the chair of the Legal Service Corporation?
His name is John Levy, and he's a lawyer in Illinois, and he motivates both you and me to be here today.
So his father was Edward Levy, who was Attorney General, but who was one of the first chairs of the board before John Levy?
Hillary Clinton was a chair of the board.
And you are, I'm sorry? So now how long have you been involved with the Legal Service Corporation?
You know, I was appointed by President Obama, and in fact, it is still the Obama board, because since the Trump administration would like to shut it down, there haven't been nominations of new people. It's a bipartisan board, and so our terms have officially ended, but we're still running the organization because it's actually set up as an independent, private nonprofit due to prior fights during the Reagan administration, earlier opposition. So it's somewhat insulated from the government.
So Ken, when you talk to your colleagues at the Business Council, the Business Roundtable, how many of them say to you, I really care about this issue?
I think I could count that on the fingers of one finger.
Okay. Okay. And that's because they don't see the economic cost to our society, or they just have so many other things they think are more important?
I think it's both. I think we have to create an awareness that this problem is one that needs all sectors of society. It's unfair to ask the legal profession to do it by itself. Government has a role, business has a role, civil society has a role. I think we all have to come together and recognize that, you started off with Gideon. There's a principle behind Gideon that as citizens, we want people to enjoy access to justice. And if you don't have a lawyer, in many cases, access to justice is meaningless. So from my perspective, the principle behind that is something that we all share in. I think the problem with business people is today in the challenging business world, they're more focused on what their shareholders are demanding tomorrow. It's not that they don't care. It's that their attention is being drawn away by the demands of shareholders.
What was the market capitalization of your company when you became the CEO?
Oh, I believe it was like 80, 90 billion.
So it's more than doubled, and even though you're spending time on this issue. So maybe other CEOs should watch this, and maybe their company's value would go up as well.
Well, I'm not so sure there's cause and effect there.
Really? You can argue that there is. Okay, so Becky, right now, if you were going to try to deal with income inequality and you were president of the United States and you wanted to solve this problem, what would be the one or two things you think are the most likely things that could be done in the 5 or 10 year period of time? You can't solve it overnight, that could solve income inequality?
He wants me to say access to justice.
Right.
I think access to justice is an important part of making sure that people can live out the rights they have and their abilities to do their stuff and make a living and so on. But income inequality in our country right now is a product of other big structural forces like tax laws. And access to justice is about getting what you should have under the laws as they are, not about those kinds of big structural changes.
Okay. Ken, you were initially on the President's Economic Council, and then you resigned. Why did you resign from the opportunity to meet with the President and go to the White House?
It had to do with the events in Charlottesville and the comments that were made shortly after that by the president. And I said that I don't think it's a political issue. I think as a country, we aspire to be a rational, tolerant, hopefully enlightened collection of free people. And we believe in certain values. And I thought that people needed to stand up for those values.
Okay. So after you did step down, I think other CEOs followed suit. Is that right?
Yes, they did. In another couple of days, people stepped
And
off.
the council collapsed.
Yes, it did.
So, Martha, your father, Newton Minow, now at the age of 93, was the chairman of the FCC under John Kennedy at the age of 34. So how do you get to be the chairman of the FCC at the age of 34? And what did he tell you about John Kennedy? Did he actually know him very well?
So my father is a proud veteran of World War II, and people grew up pretty fast who served in the war. And he came back from the war, and then he went to college, then he went to law school. And he felt, as many did in that generation, the great generation, that the cause of democracy required active citizenship. He became involved in politics. He worked for a man named Adlai Stevenson, and Adlai Stevenson decided to run for president. My dad worked on that campaign and met a young man named Bobby Kennedy. So my dad and Bobby Kennedy shared rooms on the road, and they would talk at night about what was happening in the country, and they both worried about media. And so when his brother was elected, Bobby said to his brother, I think you should get Newt Minow to come in and clean up television. So that's what happened.
Your father was the one who said that television at the time was a vast wasteland. What does he say today about television?
So my father, who's a newsaholic and has televisions in every room in the house, he jokes that his tombstone will say "off to a vaster wasteland," but he actually thinks that one of the great transformations of the media world from the era in which he served was the creation of the satellite, which opened up the possibility of many, many more channels. So while there's lots of garbage, there's also some quality.
Ken?
I think the other challenge we have as citizens in our country is that with that proliferation of channels made available by satellite and cable and the internet, we no longer go to a place to get a common set of facts. we now hear exactly what we want to hear because we tune in to people who already agree with us. And I think it's made it much harder to have civil discourse in our country. People who disagree with you are not wrong anymore. They're your enemy.
By the way, your company makes statins, is that right? Or
Correct.
and should I take a statin? Is that a good thing to take? Is it necessary everybody take a statin or?
Statins have extended life a great extent. I think they should be in the drinking water.
Really? With the royalty paid to? Right, okay. Okay, so when you get a Genius grant, what are you, do you have to do anything? Is that just, they just show up and say, here's the money and do whatever you want? Do you have to do anything for it?
No, you can buy a boat, whatever you want. Yeah, because the idea is that it's sort of, what will you do next? You're free to do whatever you're going to do next, and they hope it's useful, but they're making a bet.
So do you apply for these? Where do you apply?
There's a secret nominating committee, and then a secret set of spies that they interview about you, and then a secret review process, and so it's a total surprise.
Okay. So,
And Becky is I'm on the board. So Becky is the first person to get this award who works in the field of access to justice.
okay. Have you ever given anybody to any of these to private equity people? You haven't done that yet? The highest calling of mankind, you haven't awarded these people anything yet? Okay, well,
We'll
maybe think
explore
about it.
We'll explore it.
Okay. So, Ken, you obviously have an important position in the business world, but clearly people would say to you, run for office, take a government appointment, do other things in public service. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to do anything else in public service other than talk about civil justice, or are you going to maybe someday run for something or become a government official?
So I don't have any aspirations to run for anything, but I do think all of us as citizens have to find some part of our life where we can contribute to the public good, and there are lots of ways of doing that without running for office.
Right. Okay. And do you have any interest in going to government full time? I assume not in this administration, but maybe some other time?
You know, I am so lucky to be able to teach talented people from all over the world, and I encourage people always to run for office. And I once made the unfortunate assertion that I would contribute to anyone's campaign. And boy, I mean, that really has been a challenge.
Okay. So, Becky, any interest in going into government service, public service?
I think my role is to be an independent researcher. So to provide the kinds of information that policymakers and government folks can use to think about how to do what we all want to do.
Right. So I was in government service. I was in the Carter administration. I helped to get inflation to 20% or so. Nobody has invited me back since then. So I probably am not going to be going to government service again. So before we take questions from those of you who are here, I just like to, the message we'd like to convey is to those who are watching or those who are here, is that civil justice is something that isn't working completely the way it should in our country. There's a number of things we could do to improve it, but among other things, increased appropriations for Legal Services Corporation would be one. Other ways you can help are talk to members of Congress about this, talk to your legal representatives elsewhere about the importance of civil justice, and to the extent that you know of people that have civil justice problems, direct them to people that might be able to help them, the Legal Services Corporation or such, because many people who have these problems don't know that if they had a counsel, and they're entitled to try to get a counsel, not legally entitled to it, but that they had a counsel, they would be better off and they might be able to resolve their situation much better than they would without counsel. And in the argument at the Gideon case, later Justice Fortas made the case when he was arguing before the Supreme Court. It was a criminal matter, but he said this. He said that the greatest lawyer in the country in those days was seen as Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow, a very famous lawyer, but he was accused of jury tampering once. And Justice Fortas said, Abe Fortas then, not Justice, he said, well, here's the greatest lawyer in the history of our country, the greatest trial lawyer. And what did he do when he was accused of jury tampering? He got himself a lawyer because he recognized that he couldn't try his own case, and he was as good a lawyer as there is. And so everybody, I think, can benefit from some legal representation. And what we've been trying to do up here is to really let people know more about this. And the Daedalus piece, This is something from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is an organization that goes back to the early 1800s, started by John Adams. And it's really designed to let people read more about the civil justice problems we have in this country. And I think if they were to read this Daedalus issue, which is a publication of the American Academy, they'd learn much more about it. And I think probably maybe help instill in them the desire to try to work on this issue. So why don't we, unless any of you have a final comment before, yes.
Americans spend more for Halloween costumes for our pets than we spend on civil justice.
More on our Halloween costumes for our pets. Wow. Okay. So that's sobering. So why don't we ask people if there's any questions? Anybody have any questions? Go to the mic, identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Judy Falk, and this is a question for Becky. You mentioned that there are non-lawyers who could help with this, and I wondered if you would amplify with perhaps some examples from other countries or ways in which those of us who are not lawyers can help.
Sure. Actually, all around the United States right now, there are different kinds of people who don't have any formal legal training who are assisting people who don't have lawyers but may face somebody who has a lawyer on the other side with their justice problems. And so one of the great examples of this comes from New York City. They had something called court navigators, and they were in the eviction courts working with unrepresented tenants who were facing landlords who had attorneys, which at that time, I think 8% of the tenants had attorneys and 97% of the landlords had attorneys. So there was a big imbalance, and people wanted to design a program that they could maybe afford. It was a little bit cheaper than attorneys to provide this service. And so some of these navigators were trained social workers, and they would work your case through its entire time. So from the moment you came to the courthouse through the end of the resolution. And they would do two things. They would go with you to every appearance that you had. So when you went to the clerk's office, when you were before the judge, when you met with your landlord's attorney. And then they would also work with you outside of the court to help you connect to benefits and services that you might be eligible for that would help you pay your rent, because all these evictions were for non-payment of rent. And the landlord doesn't usually want you out. The landlord usually wants your money. So if you can show that the tenant can pay that in the future, then the landlord will say, okay, we can resolve this problem. So in the first year of that program, their success rate was 100%. Nobody they served got evicted. And they cost about half of what a legal aid lawyer costs. Now, they didn't take every case. So if a case came in where there was a complex legal issue, or they thought, wow, there's a really fancy legal defense here, they would refer that out to somebody with legal training to do the legal stuff. But it's clear, I mean, this is just one example. It's clear that there's a body of serious civil justice problems that many people in this society experience that can receive really meaningful assistance from people who are not fully qualified attorneys.
Can I make just one more comment? We talked about the criminal situation versus civil. What people don't realize is that habeas corpus or post-conviction work, including people on death row, that's actually under the civil jurisdiction of the courts. So you don't even have a right to counsel if you're facing a sentence of death.
Well, as related to what Martha said, in our country, we used to have, I guess, debtors' prisons the early part of our country's history, and they had that in Europe and so forth. But we, in effect, have that now because if you have a civil fine levied against you because you didn't have a lawyer and you didn't really do that well, the civil fine, if you don't pay it, eventually you're going to go to jail. So it's, in effect, a debtor's prison. Okay, question?
Actually, I have a comment. I would like to help Ken not feel quite so alone. There's a letter from 362 corporate general counsels that was signed by some of the biggest corporations in this country in support of the Legal Services Corporation funding. This is the third year in a row that they've done it. It includes Apple, American Express, Walmart, Disney, the biggest corporations in this country. And as somebody who works for the Legal Services Corporation, I can't tell you how helpful it's been to have corporate America go to Capitol Hill is what's enabled us to get bipartisan support in the face of the White House continued push to eliminate funding for LSC. So I really want to thank Ken, but make sure everybody understands there's been a huge push from corporate America of understanding the role of rule of law and access to justice for American business.
That's an important point. Thank you for making that point. I wanted to ask Martha or Ken on that point. Is it the Democrats only on Capitol Hill that are supporting Legal Service Corporation, or is it bipartisan?
It's absolutely bipartisan. And in fact, this past year was the largest number of Republicans who were signing letters and avidly supporting an increase and not just defending its existing budget, but actually supporting what ended up being a $25 million increase. Because Senator Shelby said to me, he's a Republican, he's a lawyer. He said, I know that the system doesn't work if you don't have lawyers on both sides. It's a bipartisan issue. This is not a partisan issue.
Okay, question?
In answer to the issue that was raised earlier about who can represent people other than lawyers. So a lot of these issues, civil issues that people have, ends up not in court, but they end up in administrative hearings. And in a lot of these administrative hearings, you don't have to be a lawyer to represent people. So there's the possibility of training people who are not full-fledged lawyers, could be paralegals or whatever, to be able to do those types of hearings and, getting more bodies there representing people. The other thing that happens, I know through some of the legal services, but mostly through law schools, are legal clinics where people really make a lot of use of law students to go out and represent people, in a lot of these issues. Now, that's a group of people that's really in flux. You train them and then, they're not law students anymore. But I know from the time I went to law school, which was quite a while ago, and now the increase in clinical work in law schools is just, I can't believe the clinics that people have now in law schools. When I went, there was like 2, that you could do. My daughter runs the unemployment compensation division in a legal services office. And she has trained law students in Philadelphia from all the law schools in Philadelphia. And that the only way they are able to actually even represent this, and I don't think it's a small number, but the number of people that they represent now is by using law students. Because, and so I don't think law students are the answer. I mean, they're a force out there that can be used. I mean, the answer is more funding for more lawyers for legal services. But I think now, in a lot of places, law students are filling some of the voids that are out there.
Okay, how many people here are lawyers, actually? Okay, how many people would like to be lawyers? Anybody? A couple of people. Okay. All right, question?
Yeah, and how many people wouldn't be lawyers if you paid them? My question is mainly for Martha, but others can weigh in. As you well know, the history of legal services, apart from periodic efforts to starve it or even abolish it, is one of limiting the jurisdiction or the ability of legal service attorneys to take certain kinds of cases, including cases that make for substantial structural reform and might deal with the basic problems of inequality. So I guess my question is sort of twofold. One is, to what extent do NGOs meet the need that legal services no longer can meet? And second, in the best of all possible worlds, would you like to see these restrictions lifted, or are they actually helpful in that they are one of the reasons there is bipartisan support and they make it easier to lobby for funding for the kinds of divorce, rent, etc. cases we're talking about?
So it's a very important and perceptive question. It's true over a series of many different administrations. Opposition to the existence of Legal Services Corporation has led to restrictions, including that no one receiving those funds can bring a class action, meaning to aggregate the plaintiffs. And there are other restrictions as well, cannot represent, for example, non-citizens in immigration matters. And I would say I don't like them, but every grantee that I know has found ways to refer cases to other legal services organizations, legal aid organizations, law firms. Pro bono is a crucial part of the picture here. The pro bono work by corporate counsel, as well as by law firms. And so what we have is a rich ecosystem of representation. And also, even though there's a bar against class actions, a legal services attorney funded by the federal agency in Maine had a client who had a problem with a mortgage where the paperwork wasn't well done. Some of you know about this issue of robo-signing, and it wasn't accurate. He brought litigation just on behalf of his one client, because he wasn't allowed to ever have a class action. It led to a $25 million settlement. So even without a class action, a legal services attorney can do tremendous work that advances justice. Here's the thing. Civil rights, civil legal issues are not self-enforcing. You have to be proactive. And the lawyers can actually, even representing one person, make the difference. Now, your second question is absolutely accurate. I have heard from many, many Republicans, you may not like these restrictions because I'm pretty clear I don't. They say, but that's why I can be all in. And look, I think that's a good enough reason for us to go forward and defend it as it is, and meantime, work out the ecosystem and the referrals so that others can do the other kind of work.
So, Martha, somebody might be watching this. What's the best way to get into Harvard Law School? Do you have a rowing team? If they say they rowed in college, would that help, or that doesn't help? Rowing doesn't count to get into Harvard Law School?
We have no athletics at Harvard Law School. And it's, there is a terrible further expression of inequality in America, is inequality of the access to higher education, of which the recent scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. What I will say is that law schools are a little bit different than colleges, and you just can't get into a law school, certainly not to our law school, without the merits. It just won't happen.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. And can I have final comments? Becky, would you have make a final comment on anything that we talked about?
I would love it if you all went out of here and talked to your friends about how access to justice should be a voting issue. It's an important part of being a resident and a citizen of this country. And if we don't have it, our laws mean nothing.
Ken?
I would just simply say that, a lot of people raise pragmatic, practical issues. It will cost too much for us to do this. We should not lose the principle that is emblazoned above the Supreme Court, equal access under the law.
I've had the privilege to work in post-conflict situations, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, and to be involved in trying to make sure that there's aid, that there's housing, that there's medical care. It was a revelation to me that I learned from people in that situation. If they don't have the rule of law, if they don't have courts that are respected, it doesn't matter how much aid we deliver, because people won't respect that actually this is somebody's house, this is somebody's and food, because there's no respect for the rights of other people. I now understand that the rule of law and access to justice is a basic, fundamental predicate for every other aspect of rights and human dignity.
Let me make two final comments if I could. First, I want to thank all of our panelists for coming here. Inconvenient for many of you to get here, and thank you for flying down and coming here. All of us who were alive when President Kennedy gave his inaugural address remember the signature line of that speech, which was, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And, it wasn't clear what he really wanted people to do, but as a result of it, things like the Peace Corps were started and other kinds of things where people could contribute to their country. But in the end, he ended that speech with a sentence that I think is just as important, and I wanted to remind everybody of it. "With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own." And so I like to think that working to make certain that people get civil justice is God's work on earth. And I hope all of you will think about this and what you might be able to do to improve civil justice in this country. And by letting people know about this issue, talking to members of Congress, talking to lawyers, I think you can make a difference and you can help your country in this way. Let me just conclude with a final comment about a lawyer that I have interviewed, Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts. And I'm not promoting my book, but this is part of the interview in the book. And I asked him, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States? He said, no, I had no interest in that. Did you want to be a justice of the Supreme Court? No. Did you want to be a judge at all? No. Did you want to be a lawyer? Absolutely not. Well, what happened? He said, well, I always wanted to be a historian. That was all I cared about. I love British history. I love American history. I told my father, I want to be a historian. And my father said, well, you won't be able to support a family very much because you won't make a lot of money. You're going to write books and people probably won't read them. He said, I don't really care. I want to be a historian. His father said, okay. So he went to Harvard. And after his junior year, majoring at Harvard, he came back from Indiana, where he lived, got off at the airport, at Logan Airport in Boston, got into the cab, and said to the cab driver, please take me to Harvard. And the cab driver said, are you a student there? Yes. What are you studying? I'm majoring in history. The cab driver said, well, that's what I majored in at Harvard as well. So John Roberts changed his decision and he became a lawyer. And the history is different. Thank you all very much.